All right, here we go. Okay, so it's good. It's good. The screaming helped. Okay, so we live in life with the full gamut of emotions, and most of the time, that's what troubles us. What holds us back from being motivated is worry. What holds us back from making amends is anger. We're dealing with one anguish or another, one yoga, one woe or worry or whatever it is. We're emotional turmoil most of our life. I mean, obviously we have good moments. We celebrate. Even celebrations come with their challenge of emotion. So emotion is probably in our generation. Someone, my dear friend Rabbi Hershkowitz, he used to always tell me. He says, in the midbar they have what they call the Dor Hadeya. We live in the Dor Hadaiga, the world of worry, because everyone's worried. Everyone is a psychologist. Everyone needs a therapist, marriage counseling. And it's true. It's a very fragile. We live a fragile existence. There's so many. We're torn a million ways, and especially in the times that we're living in, just difficult. The unknown, the loyadat, the thing that we don't know what's going on. So anyway, I was thinking once years ago, where do we start davening? I mean, it's such an important thing, emotional health. Where do we daven for that in davening? We don't really, and we sort of refeinu about being cured, but we don't really talk about staying healthy either. But maybe refeinu. But where do we have emotional health? And it's interesting. There's one place where we daven, and the Vilna Gaon interprets it to mean that. We ask for Hashem to take away our from a sorrow and groan, which is basically emotional stress. Hashem, take away. And the question is, which bracha do we find it in? It's in the bracha that seems to be unrelated. It says, we pray to God, restore our judges as they were in the earliest times, and our counselors, as in the beginning of this. Anyway, they had good therapists in the old days, and the judges were therapists. What does it mean the judges were therapists? What does it mean that the shoftim are the ones, the leaders of our people, were the ones who helped us deal with sorrow? They dealt with, practical halacha. How do we paskin? How do we lead? But yagin v'anacha. So, of course, the obvious answer is, and you'll read the article that will come out this week, that of course, the Rambam writes exactly, describes what a Jewish judge is. And it's not just about his erudition and his brilliance in scholarship, knowing what Dal Chalke Shulchan Aruch. It's more about his humanity. And he goes and he depicts Shlomo HaMelech, David HaMelech, and other great leaders in Jewish history who were great, who understood the human spirit and knew how to judge every situation. Judge doesn't just mean to judge halacha, and a judge and give perspective and help people see not only their halachic life, but how to expand it into our life. So what I took, I found this article, and I realized I was going to read it. I made a copy of it over Shabbos, after Shabbos. I read on Shabbos, I kept it after Shabbos. And you say I was going to insert it. I said, today I'm going to start off with it, even though I was going to end off with it, or maybe bring it in a later date. I want to read a beautiful story because I knew the Novominsker Rebbe to some extent. I had interactions with him over my life, and my wife's family was particularly close with him. And someone wrote an article, Rabbi Yitzchak Eisman, in the Mishpacha magazine. He wrote an article called "A Friend Indeed," and I want to share with you what it means. What a Jewish leader, not just in terms of his leadership, in terms of his knowledge and his lumdus and his inspiration, but his humanity. It's a great story, and it does touch on the topic of Einos Dvarim, because you'll see in the story, there was an aspect of Einos Dvarim in it, and the antidote to Einos Dvarim is how the Rebbe, he did it like this. So he says like this. He says he didn't have much to do with the Novominsker Rebbe, except when he was a young man in the 80s, when the Rebbe was already living in Borough Park, he would come to Washington Heights to deliver a Chumash on Thursday nights. And this is Rabbi Eisman from Pesach writing it. There weren't many volunteers to drive the Rebbe back to Borough Park. And that meant returning to the Heights around midnight. He would go drive the Rebbe after the share where he was learning, I guess, and he would drive him back, and he would get home late after midnight when the prospects of finding a parking were very bleak. He had to go back to Washington Heights after this. But I jumped at the opportunity to drive the Rebbe home. As the Rebbe came to a share, Washington Heights, he would drive me, he'd go back, and he'll find a spot, even if it takes till 2 a.m. in the morning. He always sat next to me in the passenger. Number one, when the Rebbe came into the car, he didn't sit in the back like, a melech. You are not my chauffeur, he said. And he would always ask me if I was in a rush. And I'd always reply, I'm in no hurry. And the reason for this question was, you can imagine, the Novominsker Rebbe was a popular man. And countless times he had to make many stops to take care of his communal needs. Sometimes he would ask me to stop on the west side so he can visit someone. Other times he'd ask me to stop at the hospital. This is late on a Thursday night, whatever it was, to be gechaylim. When I asked him if I could ask a question, he said, "It's always a pleasure to speak with you and learning." Although I am a Litvak, I soon caught on that there were cultural differences between Washington Heights and Borough Park. In the Heights, he was Rav Perlow. Once he crossed into Brooklyn, he became the Novominsker Rebbe. For stops in Manhattan, I stayed in the car, as was not in the case in Brooklyn. In other words, he was a Rav, you wait, the Rav goes in, he comes back, in the hospital, you wait outside. But in Borough Park, the Rebbe, they expect the Rebbe to be accompanied by the Shamas. So he says, often we would stop in Borough Park at a Vorah L'chaim or at a Chassan to say Mazel. The Rebbe never said a word. Some, however, I knew that these times I should accompany the Rebbe inside. Well-wishers would surround him, and after a few minutes, he would look in my direction, and I knew that meant I should walk over to him and begin to escort him out, because that was the court procedure when you're a Rebbe in Rome. Do as the Romans. The one special memory I have of these special rides occurred 38 years ago. This is the story. We stopped at a L'chaim, and as usual, I accompanied him to the room. I stood to the side, attempting to be as unobtrusive as possible. After a few minutes, he glanced in my direction, and I began to walk toward him. One of the Baalei Simcha understood what was going to happen and said, "The Rebbe doesn't have to leave now. Don't worry, I'll take care." He went to the Rebbe, and he obviously says, Baalei Simcha says, "I'll take care of your Balagola." Balagola is an expression like in all the Baal Shem Tov stories. You know, he went with the Balagola, the wagon driver, you know, the proverbial wagon driver, the simpleton who drove the wagon, says, "Don't worry, I'll take care of your Balagola." And he then pressed $20 in my hand, the Balabas who's making the Chaim. "A good Nacht, you can leave now," the Balabas told me, he's reporting, "and take a piece of cake with you to the car." The Rebbe saw everything, and everyone around him sensed that something was awry. Without fanfare, and obviously this man must have been a wealthy man, and you know, but it didn't make a difference. It says, the Rebbe walked over to me, put his arm around my shoulders, and said with a smile, "This is not my Balagola. This is my Thursday night chavrusa. Without him, I would sleep the whole way home. He's my good friend and a Baal Chesed." Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changed. The man who had pressed the $20 bill into my hand quickly apologized. I was transformed from being a Balagola to being the good friend of the Rebbe. The disparity between us was striking. The Rebbe was 30 years my senior, a Rosh Hashiva, a world-renowned Gadol, B'Yisrael, and a recognized leader of Klal Yisrael. I was a Kollel young man, this may ring cue to all of us, driving a 1976 Caprice Classic. Yet none of that mattered on that Thursday night in Borough Park. On that night, I became the good friend of the Novominsker Rebbe. That's an amazing story. That's Hashiva Shetenik Roshena V'Yotzeinu K'Vatchila. Amazing. Such a beautiful story. It really says so much about, you know, of course, he was a great scholar and a great leader and a great influencer, but that's a great story. So I'll just tell you a little story. We're not going to learn the Sefer tonight, but this fits into our Dvar. The man who called him a Balagola, you refer to a guy who drove the Rebbe as like the Balagola. You weren't kidding. He overheard him say that. It's an insult. I mean, here he was, and the Rebbe obviously appreciated him. He was very devoted. And he was a young man, even a young man. You have to be careful what you say. And certainly the Rebbe fixed it by showing how valuable he was to him. I'm sure it inspired this, Rabbi Eisman, I'm sure it was part of what attributed to his great success as a marvelous rabbi. He's very popular and influential. So I just tell you, he says, my friend. So years ago, I wrote an article in the Journal of Contemporary Halacha and Modern Society. It used to come out, I don't think they still put it out anymore, but they put out many. I wrote in the second volume. And I was learning in Kollel, in the Kollel in the Varduk. And I wrote an article about Chukas HaGoyim, the license in Torah, Leisecha b'Chukas HaGoyim. And I had many questions that I wanted to ask, and I happened to learn the Kollel with Reb Mordechai Tendler, who was a grandson of Reb Moshe Feinstein. And I submitted a list of questions and asked him, because he used to take care of him, and he would submit it to him. And Baruch Hashem, I received back a beautiful letter. For some reason, I never got the original, but I have a copy of it. And if you look in the Chelik Ches, I think it's the 8th Chelik, there's a tshuva. I mentioned it different times, and Reb Moshe wrote me a tshuva. Baruch Hashem, I can, I go into history. Now I'm in the books Now it's like, it was written in the Sefer Zikaron, L'man Yamdu Yomim Rabbim. At any rate, but I noticed a beautiful thing. When Rabbi Moshe wrote the letter, he didn't know me. He didn't know me. And yet he signs off the letter. He writes, L'chvaid Yedidi. Yedidi, he called me. And he writes at the end of the letter, Yedidoi Makiroi, his friend and his admirer. That's it. So I went over to Mordechai. I said, listen, I haven't met you, Zayda. I was less than 30 years old. I must have been 28 years old, 29 years old at the time. I said, that's a pretty nice thing for him to write, Yedida Makiroi. She said, what's the pshat? So he said, look, I told my Zayda asked me. It wasn't Stam Moshe just wrote it. He didn't want Stam, he wrote it. He asked me, who's the one who asked the question? He says, I learned Kail, he's a friend of mine. I know him, and he's learning. He's a serious learner. So Moshe knew what it would mean for a 29-year-old punk like me. I mean, I was learning. I was a good learner. I did learn. I was serious. But he knew. And again, I have no doubt that he felt that he was my friend. I mean, he found out I was a learning Kail. I was a buddy of his Anikel, any friend of his Anikels, and he meant it dearly. Someone was sitting and learning is the Yedid of Moshe Feinstein. And I became Yedida Makiroi. So even though I didn't get it as nice as the Rebbe with a hand on my shoulder, but to get even that, and to that sense, you have no idea how exciting it is to not to fool people. I really believe it. Rabbi Moshe felt the kinship, because to every young man that said learned, he was learning, and to write and to know it was with a kavanah. It wasn't just Rabbi Moshe wasn't a person who just haphazardly did things. He wrote it and he thought, and he wrote it with a sense, and I felt it. And so again, this is a Shiva Shatana Kashana. That's really our job. And I always say, and you'll read in the article, I say, I'll bring some other beautiful story there. You may have heard it from me, but you'll read it. I just say that, what I want to say, that, I just lost my train of thought. But anyway, the idea is, what I want to say. Hold on, my train of thought. It's a hot day today. But, building people up, that's what it's all about. People just need to know what people care about. You can solve a person's depression. You can solve a person's anxieties if he just knows that there's someone that believes in him. There's someone that values him. There's someone that loves him. There's someone that believes in him. That's what it's all about. That's what gets, we're all shayftim. That's what I said. We're all shayftim because we all have to judge every situation in life. We can choose to just be a bystander and just ignore the person. Or you see someone's a little full on, you go over, put your hand on the shoulder. You're my friend. What you want to hear a good Dvar? Maybe I can offer you a coffee. Those little things. It's Hashiva Shateng Shatzena. We have a million opportunities in a day to make a judgment call, how we approach them, and infuse positivity in other people and create a world. And I'm running the Dali Mincha. Have a great day, everyone. We'll see you.